This is episode 148 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, it's been a busy couple weeks of travel, and this week I was in New Orleans, Louisiana, with folks from Americans for Tax Reform, and that includes Grover Norquist, the founder and head of said organization. And aside from being unusually cold down in New Orleans this week, it was a great time to convene with other heads of organizations involved in fighting against higher taxes. And I spoke on a panel, told folks about the pitfalls and problems with mass transit projects like the Rail Runner and ART. But one of the things that really I did a lot of thinking about while I was there was Americans for Tax Reform has a pledge that you can sign as a candidate, as a politician, at pretty much any level of office, all the way down to state legislator. And the idea is you pledge to your constituents not to raise taxes. And it's a tool that's been used by Americans for Tax Reform to help mostly Republican legislators separate themselves from their Democratic colleagues who are much more interested in raising taxes and increasing government spending. And, Grover Norquist went through the numbers when I was in this conference about how things have changed since Republicans have started taking the pledge in large numbers. And I think the overwhelming majority of, statistically of Senate and House, not to mention almost all Republicans in those bodies, take the pledge and they say they are not going to raise taxes. And as long as they keep that pledge, it's a very powerful tool. And we're going to redouble our efforts at the Rio Grande Foundation to ensure that, especially Republican candidates as they run for office in 2020, make a clear statement that they're going to be at least not raising taxes. And hopefully it's even easier than normal because of the big budget surplus we're going to be facing. But, 2019, Republicans too often supported tax increases in the legislature.
Excuse me, without a doubt. And it's interesting, in New Mexico, for example, we had a record huge $1 billion budget surplus, and they put this kind of poison pill tax increase in there to raise taxes if they don't get enough revenues. Well, the whole point of the Grover Norquist is government never has enough money. Never, ever, ever, ever. And without something like that, government would just continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. And so, you have that pledge nationally. Colorado has their initiative where you have to have the voters approve it. New Mexico, we're kind of left unprotected, as it were, and don't think that billions of dollars of new oil and gas revenue is enough to keep other taxes from going up. That at least wasn't the case this last session. I have a sinking feeling that without a lot of effort, that may happen in the coming session as well.
Yeah, and we're also going to be doing some work on the issue of these tax and spending limitations, and trying to, if not outright limit the money spent in Santa Fe, which probably is impossible. We're going to be at least spreading the message and the word to educate New Mexicans that, hey, if we had some kind of spending limit on the books in New Mexico, more money would be flowing perhaps to your bottom line as a family or individual, and less of it would be taken up in government. And I think that message needs to get out. The amount of money flowing into New Mexico is it's ridiculous. It's incredible how much we've seen the size of government grow in the first year of this major surplus situation. And I expect that we're going to see even more spending here in 2020. I'd love to be wrong. I'd love to see some positive reforms, but I suspect we're going to get a lot bigger government.
Yeah, and we've talked on the podcast before. Alaska, you actually get a check back from the government when there's a surplus. There's some talk of that here in New Mexico, but it doesn't seem like it's gained a lot of traction. People, for whatever reason, in the state, at least policy-wise, voting-wise, have not been real supportive of limiting the growth of government. There's a confidence in government to spend ever-increasing amount of monies effectively that's really not shown to be justified based on the economic history and environment in New Mexico.
Yeah, and speaking of mass transit, or in the case of Albuquerque's buses, some large number of people riding a bus, people riding a bus, maybe in isolation. Let's go with that, because our friend Dennis Domzowski, he took some data from the Albuquerque bus system and really showed how mass transit or buses in this city are not serving as many folks as they used to even. The report is available at abqreports.com, which is Dennis's website. And he said that, using city data, boardings on the city's fixed route buses were down 7.5% over the same time period in 2018. So that's 2018 to 2019. More incredibly, people boarding the bus is down a stunning 31% since 2012, when bus ridership peaked. It's incredible how fast this is dropping in terms of bus boardings. 2012 is 9.77 million, down to 6.7 million in 2019. The amount of fares, percentage of the operating costs, has dropped from 10%, which is pretty lousy itself back in 2013, down to 7% in 2017. So just an incredible array of data from our friend Dennis Domzowski. And fare box recovery ratio, in terms of operating costs, we're almost half of El Paso and half of Salt Lake City, less than half of Phoenix and Tucson and Colorado Springs and Pueblo and Denver. We're actually a third of Denver, and just absurd how poorly utilized the city of Albuquerque's bus system is. But not a surprise. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we're not going to get into them all. But this is not a transit town, Wally.
It is not a transit town just by its layout, and it will be fascinating to see 12 days till the beginning of art and see what that does. Is that even going to be a net positive, putting all those buses on the roads, going from point to point that don't necessarily have a lot of traffic or a lot of needs? So we'll see what happens. But you are right. This is not a transit town. And all those reasons we'll talk about more at some time in the future. Buses and trains don't seem like they're the cutting edge of transportation, but that's what we seem to like here in New Mexico right now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of challenges with buses in Albuquerque. I do think it's worth noting the security challenge and personal security issue that especially is kind of a factor in that central area. I don't ride buses up and down Central. I have ridden them up and down Coors, and they're okay. I'm a pretty sizable male and don't have too many personal security issues in most situations. Up and down cores, no big deal. You've certainly seen more than a few videos of people riding up and down cores and the security challenges that are laid bare on the buses up and down that road. And we'll see what happens with ART when it does launch. I don't think there's any question at this point that that project was a mistake. It's a boondoggle. It's not working out as expected, but once it gets started, will people ride it in significant numbers? I think you're going to have some curiosity factor there, but I suspect that when push comes to shove, it's not going to do a lot for the overall system's ridership in terms of their buses. So ART is indeed right around the corner, I guess, after 2 years of delays and waiting. And will it be a good thing? I don't suspect it will, but we'll know a lot more after November 30th.
Yes, and the race to whether there will be a spaceport launch or an ART bus rider on the official ART buses. It seems like ART is in the wind, is in the lead, 12 days away, but we'll have to wait and see. Stranger things have happened on these two projects.
That's true. Yeah, you have to think that running a bus is a lot simpler proposition than sending people into near space, but you're right. It could be, there could be something that happens here between now and then as well. So, yeah, it's quite a project, and I suspect we're gonna find out a lot more about people's appetite for riding buses. I don't think it's going to change. Just having it fixed up and down Central is not going to really change people's mentality about riding buses, but maybe they'll do something at the city to make it a more attractive proposition than we expect at this point. It's going to be a lot of interest in Keller. He's a progressive guy. He at the outset, when he took office and was dealing with the ART as the problem that it is, he was already talking about expanding it down to the airport and bringing new routes into play for bus rapid transit. So he's not a guy that just wants to continue R.J. Berry's boondoggle transit project. He has his own boondoggle transit projects deep in the back of his brain that he would love to make ART seem like a success so he can push more of this stuff on the city and the taxpayers and et cetera. But he's got to sell the ART as a bit of a success in order to expand transit in the city of Albuquerque.
Yeah, and then just a final thought I have is, as I recall from college economics, is one of the definitions of economics is allocation among scarce resources that have competing uses. I mean, would a bus system be? Is it bad? A bus is there, but how much did it cost, and what else could that money be used for? Lower taxes, better programs, actually fixing the roads that cars drive on. So, I realize that in government mindset, all funds are not fungible. There's some that they put into specific pots, but we've gotten ourselves in this transit in this state into a very weird place for a very poor state that has much, I think, higher needs for infrastructure, transportation, and the like.
Well, now you're just getting crazy talking about opportunity costs. We've got these billions of dollars flying around Santa Fe, and there's plenty of opportunity available if we had leadership to get New Mexico's economy in a firmer trajectory, a more positive economic trajectory by using those dollars to reform state policies. But obviously, the preference is simply to grow government and spend more on all kinds of new programs and not really do a lot to solve systematic issues in our state economy. And, quite honestly, that takes us very conveniently to my next point. Just trying to poke some holes we are at the Rio Grande Foundation and some of the happiness, I think, the cockiness, confidence of our policymakers, especially the legislators and the governor, about the way things are going in New Mexico's overall economic picture. It's very easy right now for the governor and for legislators to say that all is well in New Mexico's economy because of the budget surplus, and that, in order to pull New Mexicans out of poverty and do all these things that they want to do, they just need to spend more money. Well, we've done that before. The truth is, New Mexico has always had an outsized state and local government structure. We've got the data going back years to show that. And we've also always had lower personal incomes than any of our neighbors. And so I took some data from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank over at Areas of Enchantment. You can read this and compared us with New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, Utah, Texas, and Colorado. Now, astute observers or astute listeners of the podcast will note that I think it was last week on the interview discussion, I noted that Colorado has much higher personal incomes. It's almost $17,000, which is just nuts, that the average Coloradan earns. It's more than the average New Mexican. That's $58,456 for Colorado to $41,609 for New Mexico. Just the average. That is a crazy differential in two states that are right next to each other. But the average Texan earns over $50,000. The average Utah, $46,000. Oklahoma as well, over $46,000, and Arizona, $44,000, and Utah, New Mexico's down at $41,000. So New Mexico dramatically trails its neighbors. This is 2018 data, so we probably got some of the oil boom in there. We'll see if the oil boom has a real sustained positive impact here. But the things we could be doing with that money to generate higher incomes for New Mexicans, to make our economy function a little bit better and put it on a more sustainable path, instead of what we're doing, which is seemingly frittering it away.
Yeah, I think that is a solid analysis. And just one thing I wanted to add along the same lines is that I have noticed, and just in the last few years, I've noticed this, that in legislative committee hearings, when they talk about the strength of the economy in New Mexico, a lot of times they don't mean the underlying free market economy. They mean how secure are flows of money into the government. And another way of saying that is the extreme of that would be if everyone was doing great in New Mexico, but the government was struggling. A lot of times that's described as the economy in New Mexico is not doing well. Well, the converse is true too. So I think it's a question of the tail wagging the dog. The reason for government is not to grow government into everything. That is, I guess you would call that the C word, communism. But the goal is to, have a government that provides a system that provides an opportunity for people to do well. And the free market is what is designed to do it. And so just because government is doing well doesn't mean the state's doing well. But, keep an ear out for that. You will hear quotes talking about the strength of the economy when they don't really mean the economy. They really mean the state government.
Yeah, I think that is a very fair analysis because, as we saw in 2019 with the oil and gas revenues that we had flowing in, there were still calls for so-called diversification and economic diversification, seemingly to the Democrats who control things in Santa Fe, was more along the lines of, well, we need to diversify government revenue sources, not diversify our overall economy and bring new businesses in here that aren't directly reliant on oil and gas. And I hate to break it to the folks up there, but when it comes to film subsidies, they are just as reliant on oil and gas as anybody else in the state, probably more so because they're getting checks essentially laundered by the state of New Mexico from oil and gas and directly into their bottom lines in Hollywood, which, when you talk about that NBC News article, I think we talked about it at one point, but that NBC News, nightly news, which don't often go to the big three networks for cutting edge analysis, but they had the oil black backed blue wave New Mexico funds progressive policy through fracking, and definitely outside of free college and the heartburn you're going to give some young kiddos with funding their free college scholarships, that's money. The idea of Hollywood accepting money directly from the oil and gas industry in New Mexico has to cause some indirect heartburn there, and it's worth noting that is in fact the reality of the situation. So anyway, we are still and probably doubling down on oil and gas revenues given the current policy situation in the legislature. Another major, well, not major, their industry, so to speak, that is professional sports, Wally, and they are the New Mexico United soccer team. We mentioned this briefly on the last week's podcast, that the United soccer team is going to be looking for taxpayer funding for their own stadium, and we now have a little more meat on the bones in terms of that proposal. It's like they want $30 million in capital outlay to help pay for $100 million facility. Now, there's a lot more to talk about on this deal, but 30 million of 100 million is not outrageous with other publicly funded soccer stadiums. But the question is, who's going to put up the other 70 million? I suspect we're going to have the city of Albuquerque, Bernalillo County, and perhaps some other tax dollars somehow flowing into the stadium. 30 million is just what they're looking for from one source. That is the state of New Mexico's capital outlay budget.
Yeah, this is one to watch. If this soccer stadium were located elsewhere other than Albuquerque, I would say that they would get all the money they need. The fact that it's in Albuquerque and the urban-rural divide that exists in the legislature, we will see. But a lot of projects of this kind need their own separate bond issue. We just had a period where all the bonds passed in the greater Albuquerque area. Obviously, that one wasn't on them. But I do think that we've not heard the last of this, and it will be interesting to see, one, will taxpayers be allowed to say whether they want to fund that, and two, will they fund that, or will they do it through other things? There's certainly a lot of bond money out there in the state and locally that might be diverted to that. And if we think back to the Isotope Stadium, that wasn't a new stadium. That was just refurbishing the old stadium, meaning they tore everything down. I think the only thing that survived was that baseball out there on the corner. But, soccer's popular. There's certainly a loud vocal constituency of the United soccer fans, and we do have a history of funding things. Again, back to that opportunity cost, I would think that the opportunity cost for a soccer stadium would be far lower. And in other words, higher net benefit, even if it's not a benefit at all to the economy, than some of the things we're spending it on, like the film program. So
a truly low bar indeed. But,
that wasn't hyperbole in your mind, Paul?
Yeah. Well, I talked to Channel 4 KOB TV about this, and a few additional points relating to the United. The location is going to be tricky. We have one area in this city where it's basically you go for athletic events. We've got one street corner, in fact, where the Lobo football stadium, the Lobo basketball stadium, and the Isotopes Park are located. The fourth corner is a BMX track. Now, other athletic facilities owned by UNM are there, including a soccer facility. Now, could that somehow be leveraged on behalf of the New Mexico United? I don't know. I also question, with the flagging fortunes of UNM Lobo football, but the stadium available, is there any way to leverage the existing UNM Lobo stadium? What do they use that thing 4, 5, 6 times a year if you include the bowl game? Uh, I just think a football stadium and a soccer stadium are similar enough that there's a real opportunity there. It's kind of odd to me in the first place that the team went and played at Isotopes Park. I think it probably has more to do with the reality of dealing with UNM's bureaucracy than than anything else, because a football stadium, you've got sight lines, you're looking at the field itself. In a baseball stadium like Isotopes Park, while people really took to that particular facility, you're seated pointing towards home plate when the action might be on the total opposite side of the field, and that's just a reality. But back to the location issue, there was a big push for the Isotopes to stick that thing downtown. And while downtown, it's a long way from the early 2000s when the Isotopes were in the market for their park, that is a fraught proposition to put soccer facility, put anything anywhere near downtown Albuquerque. There's still a lot of serious issues with downtown, personal safety being number one. Also, cost of the land. Will they get free land, so-called quote-unquote free land from the city or some government agency? Those are serious questions that need to be addressed, Wally.
Well, and you brought up an interesting point. Why wouldn't they play at the Lobo football field? And I'm not sure about the dimensions, whether it would be large enough, first of all, but just been around living life here in New Mexico. It doesn't seem like UNM tends to play real well with others when it comes to their facilities. But, if there was going to be something where you could do a joint Lobo football, New Mexico United push, do something to the stadium, that might be a highest and best use. They always talk about public-private partnerships. In this case, the public entity hasn't had a long history of necessarily playing well with others, but I do think that there might be some opportunity there if this thing is going to happen. And then you're right, downtown, boy, we would love to see in New Mexico great things happen in our downtown area, but that does seem like a mighty, mighty, mighty risky proposition at this point, particularly, like you say, with crime and other things. And Albuquerqueans don't like to go downtown. I mean, there's a subset of our population that likes downtown, that will go there, that has no problem with it. But much of the city really does try to avoid it. And would that be like the kiss of death for something that's going very, very well, New Mexico United, if you put the stadium down there and there are problems because of the systemic problems we're having with crime and traffic and the like in our downtown quarters of Albuquerque?
Yeah, and one additional note, I think it's worth pointing out, an article from Reason.com, kind of a libertarian-leaning news magazine, pointed out, just apropos of nothing, that in Boise, Idaho, they have a stadium referendum requirement. So anytime a stadium gets public financing or is proposed to get public financing, they have a law in the books saying that the voters need to be given a chance to vote on it. I think that is a worthwhile proposition. I do suspect that we could see Albuquerque voters vote for it, but we should have the right as citizens whose money is going to be put up for this project, we should have the right to vote on that. Now, I realize that we don't have a provision in New Mexico for a statewide referendum, and that's just a reality because, obviously $30 million potentially of state tax dollars could be put up. But at least residents of Albuquerque, assuming that there's a local component to this whole public financing deal, should be given the right to vote. And, I do think that issue of urban-rural divide, let alone the ideological, whether this is a good idea or not, the urban-rural divide, and should we put this kind of money up for what amounts to a way of life investments by all the taxpayers in New Mexico? Is that going to fly in Santa Fe? I think the power is certainly in the hands of the urban folks and their allies. So I suspect that probably will fly, but time will tell. So it'll be an interesting session from the perspective of stadium finance, among all the other things happening in Santa Fe in 2020.
Yep, absolutely. So yes, stay tuned. We have not heard the last of the soccer stadium. Far from it.
No doubt about it. Now, Wally, we had a discussion a couple weeks ago with Fred Nathan of the group Think New Mexico on the issue of retirement, and especially, the one that was most interesting to me. We've focused on pensions before on the podcast. The Rio Grande Foundation's done a lot of work on pensions. It was also interesting to hear what Think New Mexico is planning on offering or hoping to allow through some state policy changes, more adoption of things like 401ks by private businesses in New Mexico. But the idea of eliminating the Social Security tax at a quote-unquote cost, I use that term advisedly, reduction of revenue of about $73 million a year, that was one of the more interesting aspects of that whole conversation. And we had an op-ed, an opinion piece run a couple days ago, November the 15th, from some former tax officials with the state of New Mexico. And one of them worked for the Bureau of Economic Analysis at UNM. It's certainly a interesting case, and they basically say the title of the article is Social Security Tax Break Won't Help New Mexico's Poor. Now, that alone doesn't convince me one way or the other, but they talk about the dynamic of Social Security taxation and how a relatively small, it's less than half of New Mexico seniors would be affected by reduction or elimination of the Social Security tax. And kind of just to give you my perspective, Wally, before I throw it over to you, is cutting Social Security taxes is a fine idea. We're at the Rio Grande Foundation for cutting any tax we can get cut. So this doesn't mean that we're opposing Fred's plan, but our general philosophy is let's address the taxes that most hinder economic growth, most hinder the ability of New Mexico to, say, keep its young people in the state, and most hinder the economic diversification. So the gross receipts tax is by far and away the number one tax addressing those issues. Alternatively, cuts to personal income taxation would be a good option, as would cuts to or elimination of capital gains taxation. But really, it's the gross receipts tax followed by income taxes that have the most negative economic impact. Cutting the Social Security tax or eliminating it is a nice idea, but these gentlemen did make an interesting case for why that shouldn't be New Mexico's top priority. Wally, any thoughts on this issue, this article?
Well, the way I took it, and I may have listened to Fred Nathan's interview on the podcast with a different mindset, But I think one of the points he was making is that when you look at New Mexico as a place to attract retirement, we always talk about, well, what are our assets? What are our strengths? We have we have great weather. We have fabulous outdoor things. There's lots of things going. Well, why doesn't the state do better? The states that don't tax Social Security tend to do a better job of attracting people to those states in retirement. And I'm not sure, that. And while I do think Fred talked about that, the taxation of Social Security, what I heard was it wasn't just that is a hindrance taxing Social Security drives people into poverty in New Mexico. I think he was looking at it from what would make New Mexico a more attractive place, and it's a tiny bit of a stretch to call attracting retirees an industry, but at some level in terms of what it might do for the economy, I think it certainly is on par with a lot of the other things we spend money on in New Mexico. So that was my take. Not that I disagreed necessarily with what the Albuquerque Journal news staff op-ed piece or guest column piece said, but I think it was a little bit different than the take that Fred had in terms of the overall systemic attractiveness of New Mexico for retirees, and not for necessarily just poverty purposes, but attracting some richer retirees who would come here instead of Colorado, Texas, Arizona, some of the places they would go if we had a little more retiree-friendly tax policy.
Oh, I totally agree with that as well. First and foremost, what we do in New Mexico and have done with money surpluses overwhelmingly is spend it. Now, the one instance where you could argue that New Mexico did something a little differently was under Governor Richardson when they took the top income tax rate down from 8.2 to 4.9. Now, Richardson did a few unfortunate things. He made the gross receipts tax worse by removing the tax on food, groceries, and increasing rates across the board. He also went on a spending spree, but in preparation for his run for the White House, by building the boondoggles of the Spaceport and Rail Runner. And whether you call the Spaceport maybe a good idea at some point or not, we've been paying a lot of money for this facility, had tax increases for this facility, and haven't experienced much in the way of economic benefit for the Spaceport to date. So it's given the context of the Richardson and Martinez years, the Spaceport at least has been a total waste of money. So Richardson did a lot of different things, but the tax cuts also fell in line with the economic crisis of 2008 nationwide. So the positive impact of those was mitigated by that overwhelming national economic crisis. And, really it's why we've focused on the gross receipts tax, because looking at the structure and the way the gross receipts tax is imposed, it really does a lot of negative to business creation in the state of New Mexico. Small businesses really get hit by the GRT in ways that other businesses may not or may be able to avoid. So it's given the options in Santa Fe, I would definitely choose Social Security tax elimination. But and I don't also think, Wally, that just because a tax cut would not help the poor directly doesn't mean that it won't help the poor overall or shouldn't be considered. So I just thought it was an interesting article. It made some good points to the contrary, but that doesn't mean that we are jumping off Fred's bandwagon. We're very much in the affirmative in that idea being better than most of the alternatives that will likely happen, which probably won't involve any tax cuts or any tax reforms or anything that we would really like out of that.
Yeah, no doubt. And Paul, we've said it, but to reemphasize the point, it's interesting, even something like a Social Security tax on retirees and how the state does that, you can come at this from very, very different points of view. And depending on where you start, you might come up with very different answers. It's not to be glib in any way, shape, or form, but, if everything is done basically to reduce or to make the poor slightly less poor, that would be great for the poor in the short term, but that may be the thing that really damages the state in the long term. And I think you said it. It's 3 words in New Mexico, the tax that is really hindering capital formation, new business development, economic prosperity in the state has to be our dysfunctional gross receipts tax program. And I hear whispers every now and then, people will say, oh yeah, we need to deal with that. But boy, it doesn't seem like there's been much action on that particular tax.
No doubt about it. And I think the level of inaction is directly related to the both hidden nature to many people, certainly relative to property taxes, for example, or even income taxes, where it's pretty easy to compare across state lines. The gross receipts tax typically gets lumped in with a sales tax rate on comparisons. But when you look at the reality of what the gross receipts tax in New Mexico does and how it collects that money and what economic harm it does, it's a very different ball of wax than the traditional sales tax. And so there's a little bit of self-interest, a little bit of ignorance, and a little bit of just the way taxation works that folks are not focusing or not interested in focusing on that. So with that, we're going to leave it there, Wally. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post your comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.